Do you ever meet a recent convert to just about anything? Does the word insufferable come to mind? It definitely does seem that new converts very often feel like they have got something to prove, like they have to make up for not always knowing what they know now or think they know now, and that they know an awful lot when in actuality they know almost nothing, and that they personally need to go out and convert the rest of the world as well. How many of us went through this insufferable phase when we found, quote-unquote, found Torah, when in actuality we started just keeping a handful more commandments added to the many we were already cherishing, defending, and observing? How many of us became such a stench in people's nostrils that they decided we joined some sort of crazy legalistic cult where the prime ritual was to tell people who kept many commandments that they were lawless and rebellious because we kept just a few more? Or have you ever known anyone converted away from Messiah Yeshua, or you might call him Jesus, after years of knowing him? People who were quite obviously saved and faithful followers, but who became willing tools of the enemy and underwent radical personality changes once the Anna missionaries, usually former believers, threw a few confusing verses out of context at them and manipulated them into forgetting our master and throwing it all away? Ever watch their tactics? The zeal that was once expended on telling people that they were lawless now poured into getting people to deny Yeshua altogether. New converts, as we know, can be sons of hell when the wrong people are guiding them, or when, sadly, they are converted and then left alone without any sort of mature guidance whatsoever. Now that's what we're going to talk about today in the third part of this teaching series about the 7 polemical woes of Matthew 23. What exactly was wrong with the Pharisaic converts, and how were the Pharisees shutting people out of the kingdom of heaven? Hi, I'm Tyler Dawn Rosenquist, and welcome to Character in Context, where we explore the historical context of Scripture and talk about how it bears on our own behavior and our witness as image bearers. You can find my teachings on my websites, theancientbridge.com and contextforkids.com, as well as on my YouTube channels accessible from my websites. You can also access past broadcasts of this show on my podcast channel, characterincontext.podbean.com, or my context books for adults and families available through amazon.com. All right, so let's read the sections we'll be covering this week. And this is Matthew 23, starting in verse 13. But woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not enter yourselves, nor do you let those enter who are trying to get in. And in verse 15, woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel over land and sea to make one convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourself. Now, if you're familiar with how this section reads in some versions, you will notice a missing verse. Or is it? Which reads, woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses while praying at length as a show. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Now, although you can find that verse in both Luke and Mark, it isn't in any of the early versions of Matthew, and so it's likely that the words were added by quote-unquote helpful scribes later in order to clear up what they felt was a discrepancy. They had a copy in front of them, and if they knew the stories from the other versions from Luke and Mark, they might say, whoops, the guy who copied this before me left this out, let me add it in. You know, that it happens. That's how copying errors happen. And we see them not only in all of the different New Testament documents, but we also find them in all of the ancient fragments of the Hebrew scriptures too, and a lot of people don't know that, but it's true. Until the Masoretes really locked down and clamped down a one true version, yeah, it was the same thing. People, you get transcription errors, and sometimes you get verses added. It just happens. So, I don't want you to believe the charges that it was edited out to hide anything. It does, after all, show up in 2 other places, and no 2 gospel accounts of anything are exactly the same. Remember that these accounts were written down years later, and I can't even tell the same story accurately about what happened last week, okay? Yeah, some of you are nodding, aren't you? I'm going to read a bit from carm.org, and CARM stands for Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry. It is absent in Codex Sinaiticus and Codex B, both from the early 4th century. This verse is what they're talking about, so it's missing from these ones. Codex D in the 5th century, Codex Z in the 6th century, Codex L in the 8th century, Codex... Oh, I don't know what that Greek letter is. That's terrible. I need to learn to read. I'm not good with my uppercase Greek. Minuscule 33 and 892 from the 9th century, and other later manuscripts on in the Middle Ages. Many early Old Latin manuscripts do not contain it, such as ITA, 4th century, ITE, 5th century, and others. The majority of the Latin Vulgate manuscripts, including all of the earliest copies, also lack the reading. So when you're talking about the Textus Receptus, the Latin Vulgate lacks this verse. The verse is missing in the earliest Syriac manuscript, the Sinaitic palimpsest. What word is that? What does that word mean? Palimpsest, from the 4th century, as well as some of the later Palestinian Syriac copies. Most of the Coptic manuscripts also lack the verse, including the Middle Egyptian manuscripts, and blah, 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 blah. Okay. Thus, our earliest sources lack the verse. The verse is lacking a very wide range of sources, and there is a continuous stream of testimony to its absence throughout the centuries. The words are found in this place in only a relatively few late Greek witnesses. So these are late Greek. Among these are the Unicale 0233 from the 8th century. That's very late. And some later medieval manuscripts and lectionaries. The verse is also present here in a number of Old Latin manuscripts, including ITB and ITFF2, both from the 5th century, and others. It is also found in late medieval, Clementine revisions of the Vulgate. It's present in the oldest Syriac manuscript, the Curetonian Gospels from the 5th century, as well as, the later Palestinian Syriac manuscript, blah, 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 blah. In other words, it appears in no early Greek sources. The earliest place it does show up is in a couple of Latin sources and in the second oldest Syriac, but not the oldest. So I'm not going to teach about it here. Maybe when I get to Mark and Luke later, I will. Nothing nefarious here. No one's trying to delete it, since you can find it in 2 other places where no one doubts their authenticity. So, much ado about nothing. Folks just love a conspiracy, but sometimes the answer's really just unexciting. Now, the really big deal about this week's episode of Polemic Wars is verse 13. But woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not enter yourselves, nor do you let those enter who are trying to go in. Oh, and by the way, I've been going back and forth between the ESV and the TLV, Tree of Life version. ESV is the English Standard Version. This is from the Tree of Life, and it substitutes Torah scholars for scribes. So when I say Torah scholars, you hear scribes, okay? It isn't exactly the same thing, and so I'm not entirely happy with this, but I wanted you to be aware of the different translations. Remember that although Pharisees were a sect or faction within Judaism, which is a voluntary group of people who are reunited around similar goals and ideas about how life should be lived, And in this case, God's laws followed. The scribes were a professional class of educated men. They did everything from taking dictation to writing up contracts, serving as high, mid, and lower-level bureaucrats. But the scribes here are probably high-level retainers, quote-unquote, or quote-unquote, quote-unquote, meaning employees of the upper classes. Some might well have been Torah teachers, but all high-level retainers to the Jewish elite would have needed to be fluent in the Torah laws, which often put them in the position of also being teachers. But their position went so far beyond being Torah scholars that I don't like the size of the box that they're being shoved into here. Some were Pharisees, some were Sadducees, and undoubtedly some were neither, talking about scribes. So there are 6 woes altogether in this chapter, and these are the first 2. Woe can simply mean so many things in Scripture, from sorrow to cursing, and in this case it is cursing. And the very first charge is the most serious. So again, the routine polemic accusation of hypocrisy. We're going to see this in front of every charge. It simply meant, as Josephus told us about the Pharisees, that they were not living up to what they preached, even though he was very, very adamantly claiming that they had the correct interpretation of Judaism, as he was a Pharisee. As my wise friend Yolanda says, just because you're right, just because you're right doesn't mean that you're right. It doesn't matter what you say if you aren't living up to it. It's like on social media, people telling other folks to live when we can't even see how they live. Heck, we don't even know what their real names are a lot of times. For all we know, we're listening to sociopaths and worse and thinking they're great and righteous dudes because they talk an interesting game. So what does it say here? This is verse 13, for you shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not enter yourselves, nor do you let those enter who are trying to go in. Now, how on earth are Pharisees shutting people out of the kingdom of heaven? How can they do it? Well, in a twofold manner here. Primarily, so they're keeping Jews out by using their considerable influence to try and undermine any sort of Jewish support for Yeshua, which is the only kind of support he was going to have at this point, so I don't know why I said that. Now, it didn't work up in Galilee. They lost every single verbal battle, and they weren't the ones working miracles, healing the sick, casting out demons, and raising the dead. Josephus said that the Pharisees were so popular and liked by the lower classes that all they had to do was make an accusation in order to be believed, even if that accusation was against the king or the high priest. These guys were educated, and they reportedly went to great lengths to be on good terms with everyone during this time. Not in a compromising way, but in a benefactor way. This would have meant that they were acting as patrons, benefactors, champions, and really mediators to the uneducated, mediators between the uneducated poor and the upper classes. Because if they were retainers, that means they worked for powerful people, and if someone needed something, they could link people up. So this was a very important position, if you were poor, to have somebody who could be in your corner and go to bat for you. There's my mixing metaphors. Boxing and baseball. So the uneducated poor, they made up most of the Jewish population in Palestine, so having somebody who could be your buddy was very, very important in those days, because, it's not like you had supermarkets, and it's not like you had the kind of legal system we do today where everyone has, quote unquote, everyone has access to it. It was a different time. Now, they did try, the Pharisees and scribes, they did try really hard to dissuade the people in Galilee from following Yeshua. But by the time he made his way into Jerusalem, that final Passover, he was at the head of an adoring throng of fans who were hailing him as the son of David. But things were about to change, because he was passing into the stronghold, the power base of the Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests, elders, and scribes, and they were not going down without a fight. And they certainly weren't prepared to give up their social status and influence to this upstart artisan from the Galilee, and especially not from Nazareth. You know, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's his own disciple, future disciple, said that. These were the leaders, the cool kids, the popular cliques, and the common people listened to them. You know, in ages past, people truly believed that your social status was a measure of your inherent worth as a human being, so you listened to the wealthy and powerful. They had natural-born credibility. It's kind of like how some folks care what celebs have to say about politics, despite their having no qualifications whatsoever outside their fame and wealth and acting talent. And I mean, really, their qualification for speaking about politics is they have an audience. Yeah. So these guys, it's kind of like nameless, faceless people on Facebook who, you know, talk a good game, but you don't know anything about them. Yeah, like me. So these guys had a lot of sway. And they had the ability to shut down messianic claimants who they didn't like. But it wasn't going so well at this point for them. Yeshua was dazzling the crowds. But Yeshua knew it would be short-lived. He was about to be betrayed by one of his own, and then the elites would be able to persuade the people that he was a phony. Then they would be the only voice. Once they've got you, you know, convicted and dead, that's it. That's it, right? Or, right? Well, we know the answer to that. Now, let's look at what they were doing here. They weren't entering into the kingdom of heaven themselves. That's what the verse says. This translates to, they were rejecting God's Messiah. Their long-awaited Jewish Messiah. It certainly wasn't because they weren't keeping the commandments, even though they weren't doing a very good job of keeping the weightier matters of justice and righteousness, which means taking care of the vulnerable, the least of these. We'll talk about that sometime. That's a theme throughout the Hebrew scriptures, is justice and righteousness, and it meant something in the ancient world. John 14:6. Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. You know, it would have been one thing for the people to reject him without seeing the miracles and without personally hearing his teachings, but the Pharisees have been recorded as having sent emissaries to check him out all through the synoptic gospels. So did the scribes. These people saw the works, yet they were rejecting him. I like to put it this way. So, when they saw Yeshua, it was like they said, nah, this guy's nothing like God. Healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons, cleansing lepers, and giving sight to the blind. Didn't remind them of God in the slightest. What an insult to God that these public acts of mercy and deliverance weren't being recognized as being part of his character. That's really a grave insult. It's easy to overlook the magnitude of what they were doing, that they had these amazing merciful works worked in their midst, and they were like, nah, I don't see God. This guy must be faking it. You know, we can't insult God and refuse to recognize his visitation through his one unique Son and enter into the kingdom of heaven. They saw with their own eyes, and they rejected the evidence. Now, the second charge is, they do not let those enter who are trying to get in. Folks are trying to follow after Yeshua, but the leadership keeps forcibly getting in the way. Now, the Pharisees, we've been over this before. According to Josephus, they had the heart of the people. If they accepted Yeshua, then everyone else would have too. Well, I mean, at least the non-elites anyway, not the Sadducees. That wasn't going to happen. They had the power, all of the power, to make for a completely different outcome. But they used their influence to protect their own interests and their own honor rating, which had taken a plunge since this miracle worker from Galilee had come in and stole all of their thunder. And all they had to offer was teachings. They couldn't raise the dead, they couldn't cleanse lepers, they couldn't cure the blind, they couldn't make the lame walk, and they couldn't, well, a lot of them actually could cast out demons, so I'm not going to say that they couldn't do that. And Yeshua even admits that, what power do your disciples cast out demons? And they're going, oh, we don't want to answer this question. I wouldn't either. It's kind of like, yeah, if I'm working for the devil, then so are you guys. Hello. So this is why Yeshua cursed and condemned them as a group for shutting people out of the kingdom of heaven. I can't even tell you how serious what they did was, and it went far beyond them being hypocrites. They influenced people not to accept the Messiah who was there to answer their prayers for the deliverance from sin, because they prayed for this. They wanted salvation from sin. They wanted an end to exile. They wanted it in a different way than he was going to bring it. But he was the answer to their prayers, and they took one look at him, and they said, "You're nothing like God." Ooh! And so the people would have believed them, because these are the experts, right? Believe the experts. Except the Galileans, because they were like, dude, we've been seeing this for a long time, and this guy's the real deal, and he's doing the works. This looks like the Messiah to us. So, it's a fearful thing, and something we need to be afraid of. To have so much influence and to use it badly for selfish purposes. The more honor that came Yeshua's way, the lower the Pharisees sank on the social ladder. The more their influence over the common people was slipping away. Now remember when John the Baptist's disciples were upset about everyone going to Yeshua? This is the same sociological phenomenon. Okay, John 3:26-30. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he's baptizing and everyone's going to him." And John answered, "A person can't receive even one thing unless it's given to him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease." John was great because he, among other things, because he did what the Pharisees could and should have done. Direct the people they were influencing to follow the Messiah. That was their job. It was why God had granted them favor and authority in this life. It's why he'd given them influence. That's why our jobs in this world are so important. Most of us have a measure, big or small, of influence. And even if that's just being a mom and dad, okay, which is the biggest influence you can have. It's not just mom and dad. It's like you'll never get more influence than that except when they're a teenager and you have no influence at all. Ask me how. I know. Now, so what are we using our influence for? To encourage people toward Yeshua? Or to drive them as far away from him as possible? There is more than one way of discouraging people from following the Messiah, and there's more than one way of making his teachings look like lies. I like to, when we're looking at the woes, it's like, the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, where the Pharisee says, "Oh, thank you, God, that I am not like that tax collector. I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this." And we get to the end of the thing, and Yeshua is saying, that the tax collector walked out justified and not the Pharisee. And you know what we all do? Admit it. We all say, "Oh, thank you, God, that I am nothing like that Pharisee." And that is the punchline that a lot of people miss on that parable. Anyway, we will be right back after this short break. Hi, welcome back to the second half of Character and Context, and we've been talking about the first two woes of Matthew 23. And we've been talking about the charge that the Pharisees were not entering into the kingdom of heaven, and they were shutting people out of the kingdom of heaven. And we're talking right now about how we can do that, how easy it is for us to do it. And one of the examples I like to give is the most important one. When we're parents, do we want our kids to follow Yeshua? Of course we do, right? But do we want our kids to long for Yeshua, to follow after him, to become more and more like him? Or, like just about everyone I've ever known who, when they quote-unquote come into Torah, when they really just come into a few more commandments than they were already keeping in mainstream Christianity, just the feast and the Sabbath, and eating kosher, and maybe tassels, and maybe having the mezuzah up on the door, but really only a few more things, and frankly, the easier ones, because, really the hard ones are like taking care of your neighbor and loving each other, and those ones are horribly hard. Getting justice for the oppressed, feeding the poor, that sort of thing. Those things that actually cost us money. So, have we pushed him aside? Because a lot of us do, especially in those first years. Have we pushed him aside in favor of Torah, thinking that, we're better off focusing on Torah than on Yeshua? And Torah is important to me, don't get me wrong, but how many of us parents have found out tragically late that we gave our kids the exact foundation as the Pharisees had, without ever implanting a love and an appreciation of Messiah, who actually died for them, and who we need to come into covenant with God? Do they see us in love with him, citing all his teachings and not just the ones that give us the chance to obviously tie back to the Torah, as though we need to do that in order to validate Yeshua when God already validated him by raising him from the dead? Are we picking fights with each other, and on the Sabbath, even over disagreements like the Pharisees and their scribes? That leaves a bad taste in the mouth of Sabbath keepers. How much more of a bad taste would it leave in the mouths of those who genuinely think that Sabbath was bumped a day to Sunday? And don't even get me going on how it looks to unbelievers. If life outside of belief looks kinder and more peaceful than a believing life, then that's on us. We're shutting people out of the kingdom of heaven when we make this life look less fruitful than the world, when we become mean instead of kinder, when we become critical and nitpicky instead of long-suffering and gentle. There's a time for rebuke, but it's not every stinking day. There's more to this life than looking and seeing what everyone else is doing wrong. Most of this life is saying, well, what am I doing wrong? That's what I'm busy with all the time, let me tell you. I've been guilty of this myself, of all this and more. Have to spend a lot of time sharing about the stuff that I've did. I remember once I was, and this is really sad, and it's typical of what we see on online media, where people who have maybe been believers for a day, or who are not living any more of a credible life than the Pharisees, are all too eager to just inflict their judgments and what they think they know, and put boundaries where they don't need to be any boundaries. And, now that I'm in, this is my favorite. This is horrible. There's this site where every once in a while they got prophets, quote unquote, on it, and I've been seeing them preach the same exact thing for the last 15 years. And every once in a while, one of them will say, the door of the ark has been shut. The door of the ark has been shut so many times that I'm pretty sure the hinges are about broken from overuse. And that's very common. People will come into a new understanding, and now that they're in that understanding, oh, well, if you don't come in right now with me, the door is shut, you're on the outside, you're damned, you're not in covenant, you're not in this, and oh, really? Really? I mean, it's been going on 15 years that I know of, and it's probably been going on a lot longer than that. Yeshua still hasn't come. There's time, guys. Okay? So, anyway, this precious saint, who was told by someone in their little home congregation that they couldn't invite someone else who wasn't yet keeping the feasts and Sabbaths to their feast celebration. And no, it wasn't Passover, where you can conceivably make that call if you choose because of the circumcision requirement to eat the actual literal sacrifice on the Passover, which of course we don't have right now. So that's why it's conceivable, but it's debatable. It's everyone's personal call. I don't tell you what you can do. Don't do drugs. Okay. I'll tell you what to do. Don't do drugs, kids. I'm going to be bossy and tell you that. But the reason given was supposedly this lady wasn't in covenant. Well, the lady's a Christian. And that means she keeps the majority of the commandments that can be kept and simply doesn't keep the others because of some paradigm she grew up with, that we all grew up with, that we all believed. Until what? Until God pried our eyes open, okay? I have this theory that God pried the eyes open of the worst of us just to show us how insufferable we could be over a few more commandments. Worked with me. How about you? If people are lucky if they get in under a really wonderful teacher and they don't develop those mindsets. A good teacher, a good congregational leader, good elders can just make all the difference in the world as to how insufferable new people can be. And it was a lot easier in the olden days where everybody in the town went to the same church. And so you knew if somebody was, new convert and they were not living life and they needed to be nip it in the bud. So, but she was seeking and interested in keeping the few more commandments that we keep. So I don't know if you keep them or not. I say we. Me and the lady I was talking to. But she's seeking and she's interested in learning, okay? Not out of legalism, but because she wants to be more like Yeshua. She wants to live more like the kind of life. She wants to find out how the feast teach us about Yeshua, which is an amazingly wonderful, wonderful thing. But how terrible that, like a Pharisee, this person drew artificial lines of who is and is not in covenant based on anything. Listen to me. Based on anything other than a belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in the virgin birth, perfect life, crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua, who she calls Jesus, and so did we all once, and a lot of you probably still do. I have no problem. I was saved by that name. Okay, when my son was healed, if you heard my testimony, because I prayed over him in that name. There's power in the name of Jesus. It's about the authority. And the demons know who you are talking about. All right, and so do the angels, and so does God, and so does Yeshua. Okay, it's the faith. It's the calling on the reputation of Yeshua, all right? All right, so, and I use Jesus if that's the crowd I'm in front of. You got to be understood. Does you no good to say, do you believe in Yeshua? And people go, huh? Who's that? No, we're in America. You say Jesus. People know who Jesus is. Okay? Being obscure and not understandable is just, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it's selfish. If you're not speaking in terms that people can understand, then why are you talking at all except to exclude? but it doesn't exalt our master if we're not telling people about him because they don't know who we're talking about and they think we're talking about some pagan god. All right? And who's this Yeshua God? Is he Hindu? You know, I mean, really, if you've never heard never heard it before, that's probably what it sounds like. All right, being understood trumps absolute accuracy. Otherwise, we should be teaching first graders that, yes, we can subtract 10 from 4, but we don't teach them that. First, they get taught that you can't do it, so they understand where to put the numbers, and it teaches them how to deal with real-world situations in their own sphere. If they have 3 oranges, they can't give away 8. So there's a purpose for teaching, that you can't subtract a larger number for negative, even though in theory, it's not true. And you can be in debt, which tells us about negative numbers. Anyway, deciding which laws do and do not make you in covenant if you do not keep them is a perfect example of adding to the Torah, and absolutely ignores the Hebrew scriptures that show us in vivid, living color just how unfaithful, ignorantly and willfully, Israel could be while still being in covenant. They were punished because they were disobeying, because they were in covenant, not because they weren't in covenant. They weren't suddenly not in covenant. They were a holy people, regardless of whether they act like that. I've never personally met a Christian who acted as badly as the people of Judah were behaving before the exile, during which, yes, they were still in covenant. Shutting a saint out from a feast, really? There's no biblical precedent for it. I tell you, we all need to take a good long look at those woes and point the finger back at ourselves where appropriate. Now, what about the second woe? Woe to you, Torah scholars and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel over land and sea to make one convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of Gehenna as yourself. And of course, in the TLV, they use Gehenna instead of hell. It means the same thing. It's just the straight-up Greek word. Although we lack evidence of the Pharisees actively converting Gentiles, as like a program, is like a goal, and like sending out missionary societies. And in fact, Shammai, whom we discussed last week, was patently against it while Hillel favored it. We can read this verse in 2 different ways. And we've got to be willing to do that. We've got to be willing to have our options open within the realms of historical possibility. We can't just say anything's possible because anything isn't possible. Some things are just silly. But I'm going to give you 2 possibilities. Okay, the first one is that the house of Hillel, in some way or another, was actively seeking out converts in the diaspora and among the Gentiles living in Palestine. All right? And the diaspora, if you don't know, that's the rest of the Greco-Roman world. The diaspora, and not only that, the Parthian Empire, where there were a lot of Jews living in former Babylon. And 2, the converts they were seeking were actually converts to their faction or sect of the Pharisees. So that would be, they're trying to make Jews into Pharisees. Now, I used to teach that the first was more likely to be what Yeshua was talking about, and perhaps it was. I don't know. There are stories of wealthy Gentiles becoming believers, kings and high officials among the Gentiles, and this would have just been smart policy. In the diaspora, you had no choice whether your local rulers were positive toward Judaism or negative. They either were or they were not. Now, a highly educated Jew, if they came into the circles of these rulers, because of the Greco-Roman attraction for knowledge and wisdom teachings, well, they could capture the attention and earn the respect of their hosts. If this led to a proselyte situation, where the Gentile decides to become a sort of disciple and learn the ways of God, that benefited everyone. It benefited them, it benefited the Jews. But even if they didn't, people are less likely to persecute a people group if they admire it. What I'm not sure of is how on earth that would result in the Gentiles becoming worse than they were when they were just straight up idol worshippers hating Jews. But then, despite my growing collection of wrinkles, I wasn't there, so I'm speculating. So we come to option 2, which I'm going to explore here. As a faction, and remember that a faction is a voluntary association of people with common goals and ideas for how they want society to function. Okay. So as a faction, they want to be more influential within the community and within the larger Jewish world. So with the Pharisees, the more Pharisees there are, and the more powerfully placed their membership is, the more seats they can have on the Sanhedrin court, which was the Supreme Court of the Jews, the more likely one of their own might supplant the family of Ananus as high priest. They were Roman appointees, and if Rome could appoint one family, why not another if the family of Ananus should fall out of favor? Now, the more Pharisees, the more presence among the people, 6,000 guys is not really very much spread out over an entire country. The name of any faction game is getting more people, particularly more wealthy and powerful, influential people converted to your side of the cause. They wanted the Pharisaic way of life, and particularly their version of it, whether it be Hillel's or Shammai's, to not just be popular, but to be the authoritative and legislated way of life for everyone. It's like, if you want everyone to be Republicans, or you want everyone to be Democrats, or if you want everyone to be pro-life, if you want, I hope none of you want everyone to be pro-choice. If you do, please listen to my broadcast about the adoption of our sons who were saved from abortion, okay? One of whom is disabled, so, every life is precious, guys. Where did I get to this? I don't know. So they didn't want the Essenes out there doing their own thing, especially since the Essenes, if you remember last week's teachings, were not... Man, they said some vicious things about the Pharisees. And they didn't want the Sadducees doing their own thing, especially because the Sadducees were the first century power players in government positions and within the aristocracy. They wanted Sabbath to officially be their way, and tithing, and ritual household purity, and, I imagine, a whole bunch of other things lost to history. It isn't any different than wanting everyone to be messianic, or whatever your denomination is. Except that, we keep our politics separate in the 21st century. And more than that, our kind of messianic is a faction, because the early Christians were just another faction within Judaism. I said that wrong. I said, okay, not only do we want everyone to be messianic, but we want everyone to be our kind of messianic. Make sense? Yeah. Because we don't want anyone on a separate calendar. We won't want people to say the name differently than we do. We want everyone to pray the same and do the same things. And we want everyone to agree with us. We want to be in the winning team. Yay, team! It's all about having everyone doing the exact same stuff you do, because if that happens, you are right. Right? Right? Not right. But that's the way we think. We think numbers mean credibility. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. All right. Okay, so like I was saying, the early Christians were just another faction of Judaism for hundreds of years. But, we want our flavor of Christianity to rule out, because we want the power. No one wants to be number 2. And you can take that any way you want to take it. So, Perhaps the traveling over land and sea was a bit of hyperbole, which Yeshua and every other ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman speaker uses a lot. Hyperbole is a form of exaggeration in order to make a point, like saying that the mustard seed was the smallest seed when it wasn't. And if you saw my parable of the four soils, then you know that the medieval name, this is so cool, for mustard seed was Eye of Newt. Oh my gosh, right? Right? You've waited for that information your whole life, and it's totally cool. They knew that mustard seed wasn't the smallest seed. They even had smaller seeds, but it was a visual idiom that was commonly used in the day. And like I said in the parable teachings, we say a lot of things that aren't true, but people know they aren't true, but they know what they mean. So you're not lying, you're using a shared cultural expression. Maybe he was just making a crack about how difficult it is to get anyone to join their faction, because maybe their standards were high based on the fact that they would accept not just any distant follower as an actual member. But we still have no idea about how they ran their organization, if they even had an organization, if it was organized formally or very loosely. We don't know if a poor man was allowed to join their ranks, or if they were only interested in the educated, the rich, and the powerful, or at least in the educated retainer class to the rich and powerful people. People who had influence. But given the world of the times, the social world of the times, with honor and shame, the importance of all that, I'm inclined to believe they were not interested in having the rabble, quote unquote, among their membership. Or as, I was about to say something that was wrong. Woo! Such people, in the eyes of the elites, were there to be influenced, not to influence, not to be trusted and imbued with, the ability to influence people themselves, because they were the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, who couldn't even be trusted to tithe properly if the Pharisees are the same people that Mishnah Tractate Demai calls the associates. We don't know that they were. That's another, we're talking about a lot of, talking about assumptions we make about the Pharisees being certain groups in writings where they're not specifically called Pharisees. And that's one of them. It's a fairly good bet that they might have been, but we just don't know. We just can't say for sure. It's an interesting thing to study, though. Now, on top of making the remark about how far they had to travel to actually find someone willing to join them, he confronted them with the futility of the effort, because they were just causing them to become insufferable human beings. You know how when people get new beliefs, they feel like they just have to suddenly feign that they know more than they do? Or they count their newfound knowledge as so amazing that they rub everyone's faces in it and use it as an arbitrary boundary marker as to who is in and who is out of God's favor? Forgetting where they were yesterday? The more the world changes, the more it stays the same. Human beings are still human beings, and we can still be just like the Pharisees. Of course, I don't use Pharisee as an insult, because that's like calling people Presbyterian or Southern Baptist. When anyone says, you Pharisees, it's kind of like saying, you Presbyterians. What would that even mean? Oh, I know what it means, because I used to be one. It means people who won't raise their hands above their heads in worship. We used to call ourselves the frozen chosen. It's kind of like you can't even get any exercise in that place. Definitely no dancing, but you can't even lift your hands. I think you were allowed to have them like, it's not that like there's a rule, it's just that kind of people weren't doing it, at least in my Presbyterian church where I came to faith. But we need to think about it. Do we really want people to be like us? Because the Pharisees wanted people in their faction, but it wasn't doing them a favor. In the end, anyone they converted into their faction, they were just going to influence them not to accept Yeshua as Messiah. Now, that being said, we do know from the book of Acts that many Pharisees came to faith in Yeshua. And we saw that last week when we were talking about Acts 15 and the council there. So not all Pharisees are terrible, but again, in polemic, you attack the group The group as a whole, not as all individuals, was keeping people out of the kingdom of heaven by convincing them not to follow Yeshua. And that was a very serious crime indeed. See you next week.